Whenever you dream, your brain creates an entire world. You might be running from danger, standing on the edge of a cliff, hugging someone you haven't seen in years, or having a conversation with someone who is no longer alive. While the dream is happening, none of it feels imaginary. Your emotions are genuine. Your heart may beat faster. Your breathing may change. Your body responds as though the experience is unfolding in front of you. Then you wake up. Your bedroom is exactly as you left it. The people, places, and events you just experienced never happened in the outside world. They existed only inside your dreaming brain. Yet your emotions were real. Your body's reactions were real. So how can experiences created entirely inside the brain produce emotional and physical responses that feel so much like real life? That question has fascinated scientists for decades. Because answering it isn't just about understanding dreams. It's about understanding how the brain creates emotional reality. And solving that mystery led scientists through decades of discoveries in sleep science, neuroscience, psychology, physiology, and brain imaging. The investigation begins with a surprisingly simple question. When do our most emotional dreams actually happen? For scientists, this presented an extraordinary puzzle. Dreams are created entirely inside the brain. Yet they can trigger emotions and physical reactions that closely resemble those produced by events in the outside world. How could an internally generated experience produce responses that feel so real? Researchers quickly realized they couldn't answer that question by studying dreams alone. They first needed to understand when those powerful emotional dreams were happening. Because if dreams became more emotional during one specific part of sleep, that stage might reveal the biological processes responsible for creating them. So scientists designed experiments that would allow them to observe people throughout the entire night. Volunteers slept in sleep laboratories while researchers continuously recorded their brain activity, eye movements, muscle activity, heart rhythm, and other physiological signals. By monitoring these changes, they could identify exactly which stage of sleep a person was in at every moment. Then, throughout the night, participants were awakened at carefully selected times and asked a simple question. What were you experiencing just before you woke up? That straightforward experiment became one of the first major steps toward understanding why dreams can feel so emotionally real. And what researchers discovered was remarkably consistent. To understand why dreams can feel so emotional, scientists first had to answer a fundamental question. When do emotional dreams actually happen? To find out, researchers invited volunteers to spend the night in sleep laboratories, where every stage of sleep could be recorded without interfering with normal rest. Small electrodes were placed on the scalp to record electroencephalography, or EEG. EEG measures the brain's electrical activity, allowing scientists to identify the different stages of sleep as they naturally unfold. Additional sensors were placed beside the eyes to record electrooculography, or EOG. This technique detects even the smallest eye movements beneath closed eyelids. Electrodes were also attached to the chin to measure electromyography, or EMG, which records muscle activity throughout the night. Together, these three recordings gave researchers an objective picture of what the sleeping brain and body were doing from one moment to the next. But recording sleep alone couldn't answer their question. Throughout the night, participants were awakened at carefully selected times and immediately asked to describe whatever they had been experiencing just before they woke up. By comparing each dream report with the EEG, EOG, and EMG recordings, scientists could determine exactly which stage of sleep the person had been in when the dream occurred. As hundreds of awakenings were analyzed, one finding kept appearing. The longest, most vivid, and most emotionally intense dream reports were repeatedly linked to the same stage of sleep. Scientists had found their first important clue. The next challenge was to discover what made that stage so different from every other stage of the night. As more sleep laboratories repeated these experiments, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Whenever volunteers were awakened during one particular stage of sleep, they were far more likely to describe detailed dreams filled with fear, excitement, joy, sadness, surprise, and other powerful emotions. Researchers named this stage rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, because of one remarkable feature consistently recorded by EOG. Although the body remained almost completely motionless, the eyes moved rapidly beneath the closed eyelids, as though they were actively following events taking place inside the dream. Dreams could still occur during other stages of sleep, but they were usually shorter, less vivid, and far less emotionally intense. Again and again, REM sleep stood apart. Scientists had now answered the first question. The brain enters its most emotionally vivid dreaming state during REM sleep. But that discovery immediately raised another mystery. Knowing when emotional dreams occur does not explain why they feel so real. The electrical recordings from EEG could identify the stage of sleep, but they couldn't reveal which structures deep inside the brain were creating those emotions. To answer that question, scientists needed an entirely different way of studying the sleeping brain. Instead of recording electrical signals from the surface, they would have to look inside the brain itself and observe which regions became more active and which became quieter while a person was dreaming. That investigation would completely change our understanding of dreams. Discovering that emotional dreams occurred most often during REM sleep answered an important question. But it didn't explain what was creating those emotions. The next challenge was to look beyond the electrical activity recorded by EEG and observe what was happening inside the brain itself. That became possible with the development of brain imaging techniques such as positron emission tomography, or PET, and later functional magnetic resonance imaging, better known as fMRI. PET measures how much energy different parts of the brain are using, while fMRI measures changes in blood flow, allowing scientists to identify which brain regions become more active during a particular task or state. In other words, researchers could now watch the sleeping brain at work without waking the person. By comparing brain activity during REM sleep with activity during quiet wakefulness, scientists expected to find differences between the two states. They did. But the differences were much greater than anyone had anticipated. Some regions of the brain became far more active during REM sleep. Others became significantly less active. For the first time, researchers could see that dreaming wasn't simply a sleeping version of wakefulness. The brain had entered a completely different operating state. One structure, in particular, repeatedly drew their attention. It was deeply involved in processing emotionally important experiences. Again and again, PET and fMRI studies highlighted the same region. The amygdala. The amygdala is a small collection of nuclei located deep within the temporal lobes of the brain. Its job is not to create emotions, but to detect experiences that are emotionally significant and prepare the rest of the brain and body to respond. Put simply, it acts as one of the brain's emotional alarm systems. When researchers compared REM sleep with quiet wakefulness, they consistently found that the amygdala became much more active during dreaming. That finding provided the first biological explanation for one of dreaming's most familiar experiences. If the brain's emotional alarm system becomes more active, ordinary events inside a dream can suddenly feel intensely important. A stranger feels threatening. A loved one feels deeply comforting. A small mistake feels overwhelming. The emotions become stronger because the brain systems responsible for assigning emotional significance are working at a higher level. Scientists had now identified one part of the mechanism. But another question immediately emerged. If the emotional alarm system is becoming more active, why doesn't another part of the brain recognize that the dream isn't happening in the outside world? That question led researchers to investigate a very different brain system, one responsible for reasoning, judgment, and evaluating reality. While researchers were studying the amygdala, they noticed another important pattern. Not every brain region became more active during REM sleep. Some became noticeably quieter. One of the most consistent findings involved the prefrontal cortex, the large area just behind the forehead that helps us plan, solve problems, make decisions, and judge whether something makes sense. Within this region, scientists repeatedly observed reduced activity in an area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain plays an essential role in executive function, the collection of mental abilities that allow us to think logically, compare information with past knowledge, and evaluate whether our experiences match reality. In everyday life, it's one of the brain's main reality-checking systems. When researchers compared PET and fMRI scans of REM sleep with wakefulness, they found that this reality-checking network became significantly less active while people were dreaming. That discovery helped explain something everyone has experienced. During a dream, impossible events rarely seem impossible. You don't stop to question why you're suddenly flying, talking to someone who died years ago, or walking through places that constantly change around you. The brain simply accepts the experience as real. Scientists had now uncovered a second piece of the puzzle. But the biggest discovery came when they looked at these two findings together. For years, scientists studied these findings separately. One group of studies showed that the amygdala became much more active during REM sleep. Another showed that parts of the prefrontal cortex became less active. The real breakthrough came when researchers considered both discoveries together. They realized these changes weren't happening independently. They were happening at the same time. While the amygdala was assigning powerful emotional significance to the events unfolding inside the dream, the brain systems responsible for questioning those events were much less active. For the first time, scientists had a biological explanation for something almost everyone has experienced. During a dream, you can find yourself flying through the sky, speaking with someone who died years ago, or suddenly appearing somewhere you've never been. Yet, while the dream is happening, those impossible events rarely feel impossible. Your brain isn't simply creating an imaginary story. It's creating an experience that your emotional systems treat as meaningful while your normal reality-checking systems are much less able to challenge it. That is why dreams can feel so convincing. Not because the outside world has changed, but because the balance between emotion and critical evaluation has changed inside the dreaming brain. Scientists had now answered the mystery that began this investigation. Why do dreams feel so emotionally real? But every scientific discovery creates another question. If the brain enters this remarkable state every night, what allows it to do so? After discovering that emotional and reasoning centers behave differently during REM sleep, scientists faced another question. What causes those changes to happen in the first place? Brain cells don't work in isolation. They constantly communicate using neurotransmitters, chemical messengers that carry signals from one neuron to another and help determine how different brain networks function. Researchers already knew that the balance of these chemical messengers changes throughout the day. So they began measuring how those changes differed across the stages of sleep. One neurotransmitter immediately stood out: norepinephrine. Norepinephrine helps the brain stay alert, respond to unexpected events, focus attention, and prepare the body for action. During normal wakefulness, it is continuously released by a small region of the brainstem called the locus coeruleus. But when scientists measured its activity during REM sleep, they found something remarkable. The neurons of the locus coeruleus became almost completely silent. As a result, norepinephrine levels dropped to some of the lowest levels observed during the entire 24-hour cycle. Researchers had discovered that the dreaming brain was operating under a very different chemical environment than the waking brain. But lowering one chemical could not explain the whole story. Another messenger appeared to be doing exactly the opposite. While norepinephrine activity fell dramatically during REM sleep, scientists found that another neurotransmitter remained highly active: acetylcholine. Acetylcholine helps activate networks involved in attention, learning, memory, and the processing of sensory information. Unlike norepinephrine, acetylcholine remains abundant during REM sleep, creating a brain that is highly active even while the body remains asleep. This combination surprised researchers. One chemical associated with alertness and critical evaluation had become unusually quiet. Another that supports widespread brain activation remained highly active. Scientists realized they were no longer looking at a sleeping version of the waking brain. They were looking at an entirely different biological state. This unique chemical environment helps explain why the brain can generate vivid internal experiences while responding very differently than it does during wakefulness. Researchers had now identified the chemical conditions that accompany REM sleep. But one important question still remained. Why would the brain deliberately create this unusual state every night? Neuroscientists had explained how the brain creates emotionally intense dreams. Psychologists wanted to answer a different question. Do those emotional dreams actually change us by morning? To find out, researchers designed experiments that followed people before sleep and after they woke. Volunteers first viewed photographs known to produce strong emotional reactions while researchers measured their brain activity, heart rate, skin conductance, and subjective emotional ratings. The participants were then divided into different groups. Some experienced a full night of normal sleep with uninterrupted REM periods. Others remained awake throughout the night, while in other experiments researchers selectively interrupted REM sleep whenever it began. The following morning, every volunteer was shown the exact same emotional images. If REM sleep served no psychological purpose, their emotional reactions should remain essentially unchanged. But if something important was happening during the night, the same memories would feel different the next day. For the first time, psychologists were no longer asking how dreams become emotional. They were testing whether a night of dreaming changes how the mind carries emotion forward into the future. The results surprised psychologists. After a normal night of REM sleep, participants usually remembered the emotional images just as accurately as they had the day before. The memory itself had not faded. What changed was the emotional weight attached to it. When researchers measured emotional arousal, many participants showed smaller physiological reactions than they had before sleeping. Brain imaging told the same story. The amygdala became less reactive, while regions of the prefrontal cortex became more involved when the same memories were viewed again. Psychologists realized that memory and emotion were not inseparable. The brain could preserve the facts of an experience while changing how intensely that experience was felt. This was a remarkable discovery. Learning from emotional experiences does not require reliving the same emotional intensity forever. REM sleep appeared to help separate the lesson from the emotional overload. The experience remained. But the mind's relationship with that experience had begun to change. These findings changed the way psychologists thought about dreaming. For decades, dreams had often been viewed as strange stories with little scientific value. But the new evidence suggested they might reflect a much larger psychological process. During REM sleep, the brain repeatedly reactivates fragments of recent experiences. Not as perfect recordings, but as pieces that can be combined, reorganized, and connected with older memories. Psychologists believe this allows the brain to build broader emotional understanding rather than simply storing isolated events. A painful conversation may become linked to years of similar experiences. A frightening event may become one example within a much larger life story. Instead of preserving thousands of separate emotional moments, the sleeping brain appears to organize them into patterns that can guide future decisions. Dreams may be the conscious experience of that remarkable overnight reorganization. This investigation began with a simple mystery. Why can a dream feel every bit as real as waking life? Sleep science showed us when those dreams occur. Neuroscience explained how the brain creates such vivid emotional experiences. Psychology revealed that REM sleep may help reshape our relationship with emotional memories without erasing what happened. Together, these discoveries point toward a much larger idea. Sleep is not simply a period of rest. It is a period of adaptation. Each night, the brain appears to reorganize experiences, preserve what matters, reduce unnecessary emotional burden, and prepare us to face tomorrow with a mind that has been quietly updated. Scientists are still debating the precise role that dreams themselves play in this process. But one conclusion is already difficult to ignore. When you dream, your brain isn't taking the night off. It is continuing one of the most sophisticated forms of psychological adaptation ever discovered.